And this system has the advantage of providing more direct communication.
Live televised press conferences are a mainstay in politics today, but it was President Kennedy who held the first one from the White House in 1961. The press conferences were must-see television, with the first one garnering an estimated 64 million viewers. We'll take a look at how and why President Kennedy continues to be a role model when it comes to presidential press conferences almost 60 years later this week on JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
On January 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy went where no president had gone before. He took the podium in the State Department auditorium, addressing the press in front of live television cameras with an estimated audience of 64 million people watching from home. His predecessor, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, had also done televised press conferences, but they were taped, not live. It was a bold move for the young president who had yet to prove himself. In one of the very first questions from reporters at that news conference, they asked if the president was risking grave consequences by possibly uttering an inadvertent misstatement that couldn't be corrected live. We'll take you to that moment now and look at how President Kennedy's decision would not only change the way he communicated with the public, but how it would influence presidents who came after him.
Yes, Mrs. Means?
When President Kennedy gave his first live televised press conference in 1961, it was the beginning of a new era.
The contention being that an inadvertent statement, no longer correctable as in the old days, could possibly cause some grave consequences. Do you feel there is any risk, or could you give us some thought on that subject?
Well, it was my understanding that the statements made by President Eisenhower were on the record. They may have been a clarification that could have been issued afterwards, but it still would have been on the record as a clarification, so that I don't think that the interests of our country are, it seems to me, they're as well protected under this system as they were under the system followed by President Eisenhower. And this system has the advantage of providing more direct communication.
And that direct line from president to citizen would continue in every presidency after the Kennedy administration.
Well, I've been in journalism roughly 40 years, and 35 of those in Washington.
Jackie Combs has covered press conferences for 6 different presidents, from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump. She said each president approaches press conferences in a different way.
Their press conferences are as different as they are, and some, of course, are better at it than others. And obviously, Ronald Reagan was pretty good at it because he'd been a former movie actor and was very comfortable in front of cameras. Bill Clinton was a natural performer. George W. Bush wasn't as good, and his father was even weaker than he was, even though both Bushes were very personable to deal with on a one-on-one basis.
Kennedy had experimented with television during his Senate years, which allowed him to be sharp on television during his presidential run and later as president.
Kennedy had a great advantage in that not only his natural talent and what we've come to know as being telegenic, which of course is a word that didn't exist before the age of television, but it was also such a novelty that people watched, and I mean, they'd never had that kind of exposure to their presidents except in newsreels.
President Kennedy held 64 press conferences during his abbreviated presidency, or an average of one every 16 days.
He clearly was comfortable with it, which translates into having more of them. But even when he was delivering answering difficult questions, he seemed to have a comfort level that was unusual, and even to the point of using, wit to get through them.
Mr. President, do you believe that your administration is unduly sensitive to the alleged hostility of the business world?
We're unduly and alleged. I would say that I would think that we are sensitive.
Combs said not every president found live press conferences easy. It was not long after Kennedy, during Richard Nixon's presidency, where he turned to professionals for help and ushered in a new era in political strategy.
Richard Nixon turned to public relations pioneers on Madison Avenue in New York City to sharpen his message to really create an image for him. They literally called it the new Nixon, like the new Coke.
As presidents became more experienced in the medium, Combs said they became better at answering questions in the way they wanted.
I remember early in my journalism career, some politician said to me, a good politician doesn't answer the question, they answer the question they wish had been asked.
And sometimes, Combs says, presidents could be overprepared at the podium.
Barack Obama was quite good, though his problem was he had so much to say because he was such a thoughtful president that he could go on. His answers were about twice as long as they ever needed to be on any subject.
President Kennedy's first press conference was seen by an estimated 64 million people. In the early years of presidential press conferences through Bill Clinton, they were often primetime affairs in the East Room or in other large spaces. But as cable expanded people's viewing options, Combs said presidents began opting for midday conferences to set the agenda for evening newscasts.
Certainly by Obama, you had literally hundreds of channels, and then now you had, innumerable streaming options besides. The audiences for these things became much smaller. The East Room formal press conferences that I grew up with, starting with John F. Kennedy, are a thing of the past.
Before the COVID-19 crisis began, Combs said President Donald Trump had avoided formal press conferences and instead opts for quick, informal opportunities, often done under the whirring blades of his Marine One helicopter.
But he very much controls the length, the format, and which questions he wants to ask because people are shouting at him. The availabilities at his helicopter are not a favorite format for reporters. Many of the reporters can barely hear the question. You will see White House pool reports trying to convey it and say, your White House pooler could not hear the question, but he said something about. It's not a good way for the press to get information and ask questions.
Combs said Trump isn't the only president to try to avoid taking questions in the press room. She said President Clinton avoided going before the press after difficult or embarrassing news broke. Combs said the result wasn't good for either the president or the press.
He wouldn't hold press conferences except when he had to, when we went on foreign trips. And then you'd face the embarrassment in these he would, in these press conferences where, because he hadn't been meeting with the press, the questions he would get in a foreign capital, I remember one in particular in Brasilia where there were 5 questions to each president, and 4 of the 5 questions to Bill Clinton were about fundraising allegations. They became angry that here he was in a foreign capital getting questions about a domestic scandal, quote unquote, but you had no choice because it was your only availability to get him.
Overall, Combs said while live press conferences aren't the perfect vehicle for presidents to reach out to the American people, they often provide citizens a window into who presidents are as people.
We hope to adjust our viewpoints so that we can get some action in this program.
It shows who they really are. It may be more stilted, they may be more rehearsed, but there's still a good amount of having to think on your feet.
Most former presidents have put their official papers in libraries in their home states where they are not readily available to scholars and historians who come here to work with the Library of Congress and other agencies here. Have you decided where to put yours, and would you consider putting it in Washington?
Yes, I'm going to put it in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
That library, of course, didn't ultimately get built in Cambridge. Instead, it looks over Dorchester Bay here on Columbia Point in Boston. Now we'll turn to someone who has been here to the archives on Columbia Point, my interview with historian Frederick Logval, and a look more closely at President Kennedy and how he used live television to his advantage, both on the campaign trail and as president. Well, thank you. I'm now here with Frederick Logval, who's a professor of history and international affairs at Harvard University. Fred is also working on a book on John F. Kennedy's life with the first volume due out in September. Fred, thanks for joining me.
It's my pleasure. Good to be here.
So we're here to talk about the press and President Kennedy, particularly his live televised press conferences. But let's just start before we get into those press conferences. What was President Kennedy's relationship like with the press before he became president, and then what was it like after?
Well, I think it's important to note that he himself was a journalist early in his career, as you know. And in fact, I think he flirted with, I don't know how seriously he flirted with it, but he thought about perhaps journalism as a career for himself. And so in 1945, he reported, I think he showed ability in journalism. And so I think he had an interest in reporters and in newspapers and in the media broadly from an early point. And I think once he then became a politician, first in the House, then in the Senate, and then, of course, as you say, ultimately in the presidency, this was something he cared a lot about. I think he considered himself good in his relations with the press, and had beyond all of that, I think he had a deep interest in journalism and in the press, and he liked to shoot the breeze with reporters and cared a lot about what reporters had to say about him, as I think most politicians do.
Did this familiarity from a very young age, and then someone who kind of understood what the press were looking for, did this separate him from maybe other colleagues of his in the Senate or the House? Was he more media savvy, would you say, than the average politician in Washington?
I think there's no question that John F. Kennedy was more media savvy than most other politicians. An interesting comparison here, I think, is Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson, who of course was the Democratic presidential nominee both in 52 and in 56, considered himself a man of the world. He considered himself a sophisticated guy, and in many respects he was. But he utterly missed, to his own deep detriment, he utterly missed the growing importance of television, for example. Whereas I think Kennedy, from a very early point, influenced at least to a degree by his father, Kennedy, I think, understood this as a game changer, that television is going to change how we campaign, how we govern ultimately. It's hugely important. I think he saw that from an early point. I don't think other politicians, most of them, very few of them, had that early sense that he had. And again, Stevenson is a classy example of somebody who didn't, and I think paid for it in his presidential campaigns.
And so before we get to the presidency, how did President Kennedy use the press to move along in the campaign and become president?
If you take, for example, the 1952 Senate campaign, he showed in some early appearances on the NBC show Meet the Press that he had a kind of natural, I won't say he was flawless, I think he got better as time went by, and one can see these interviews, and it's pretty interesting to compare the early Kennedy to the later Kennedy. But nevertheless, even early on, I think he had a certain natural affinity. He looked good on camera. I think he used that to his advantage in those Meet the Press segments. The campaign in 52 also had a kind of paid commercial called Coffee with the Kennedys, which showed not just Jack, not just JFK, but showed his mother, his sisters, on these kind of informal, though also somewhat stilted, to be honest, episodes that I think worked to great effect in that early Senate campaign. So that gives you a sense of how early they tapped into this idea that you can actually benefit from, in this case, television exposure to a really marked degree. The other thing I would say that was important for him from an early point was that he had command of policy. And I think that made him, and this is something that becomes more the case in the presidency, but even before that, it makes him maybe more comfortable with the press in interviews, on television, but also in print, than maybe another politician would be. He knew the policy details, and he had, in addition to that, a certain wit that becomes very evident later on, which he could use to his advantage.
Right, and we'll get to that in a moment. So turning to the presidency, his predecessor, Eisenhower, had used televised press conferences, but it was President Kennedy who first did them live on air. What was the marked change with President Kennedy starting to use live television as part of his press conferences?
I think it's a huge change when Kennedy comes in. I think he has the first of these live televised press conferences. He has the first one already, in the first week. I think 5 days after he took the office, after the inauguration, and it had an enormous impact and a very large viewing audience. About 60 million people, I think, tuned in to that first one. And it's interesting, I think there had been speculation in the White House among Kennedy's advisors, is this a good idea? Isn't it kind of risky to do these things live? What if you say something that turns out to be incorrect, that we then have to retract or correct? This is a gamble. But Kennedy felt confident in his knowledge of policy. He felt confident that he was good on his feet. And so they proceeded, and it was a landmark event. And one of the things that I find really interesting about that first press conference, first of, I think, 64 during his presidency, is the degree to which even here, if you watch maybe the first 30 minutes or so, at that point, he uses humor to an effect that I think he saw and others saw was highly beneficial and was something he would continue to do. So I think this was unprecedented, as I think you indicated, and proved to be highly important both for his administration, I think, and those that followed.
And how did this change reporting of the presidency? Because did this actually allow, because they were live and sort of unedited, straight to the viewer, did this give the Kennedy administration a chance to sort of put out their viewpoints unfiltered to the American people?
Oh, I think there's no question that it allowed you to do something that had not been possible prior to this. I think what was the case prior to these live press conferences was that maybe one or two or three newspapers would have a full transcript that they would print of a presidential press conference. But of course, that reached very few people, comparatively speaking, whereas if you could do this in total and do it live for viewers at home to watch, you could put forth the message that you want to put forth. You could show the president in command of policy questions. You could show him with his wit, his sense of humor, his decorum. You could really show off the president in a way that they quickly determined. He determined, but also his aides could have great effects, or at least significant effects for the administration and what it sought to do. And you could tailor the message that you wanted to convey accordingly as you planned for these press conferences.
Yes, and obviously, attention spans today are what they are, but even I imagine in the 60s, to get people sort of to watch these press conferences, maybe the first one's the novelty of it, but to keep coming back, I think, like as you mentioned, JFK sort of had a bit of wit about him. He was sort of charismatic. How important was that, the fact that he could use humor and how he used it to keep people watching these press conferences?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think it would be hard to exaggerate the degree to which his particular attributes worked here, and it was partly, by the way, as a function of practice. He had a way of making it look natural, but he had been through this. He had done this a lot, or at least begun to do some of this, and become more and more comfortable on the camera as a senator in particular. And he prepared for these press conferences. He had always been somebody who had a good retentive memory, so he had a good grasp of detail. He presented well. He was handsome. That's a pretty powerful package when you think about it, and especially in this kind of new environment. Also, by the way, and this is something that has changed, also happening at a time when reporters had not yet become cynical in the way that they would become later after Vietnam and after Watergate and so forth. And so there's there's mutual respect, because Kennedy's also good at showing respect to the reporters. But it's a setting, if I can put it that way, that just works in an important way.
We think about the current press corps today and the situation going on where it's sort of a very combative atmosphere between the current president and the press corps, and you talk about sort of this much more respectful period. What was it like for President Kennedy? Was he questioned hard? Did he face tough questions? Like, was it as combative as we would think of it today?
I think it was much less combative than it would be today. Partly again because of the time that we're talking about, and the way that reporters interacted with leaders. It was just quite different. But it was also something. I think it also had something to do with Kennedy himself. He understood journalism. He understood how reporters worked. He had been one himself. I think he liked them and they liked him. I think it's a kind of open secret that most reporters who covered the Kennedy White House liked Kennedy. Not all of them, and he was certainly more combative with some than with others. But I do think there wasn't just a mutual respect, I guess I'm suggesting. There was a kind of admiration that went both ways, and a desire to interact, and I think that mattered. I think that mattered a lot.
Yeah, and, we also think about spin and how, especially today, how, the press conference or the modern day press secretary goes out to sort of spin the issue for the administration positively. Thinking about like the sensitive topics like Cuba, Russia, or Vietnam, was JFK always completely forthright in these press conferences, or were there a little bit of spin?
Oh, there was a healthy, I think there was a healthy amount of spin used by Kennedy, no question. If it's a particular policy issue like the ones that you mentioned, he had a particular perspective that he wanted to put across, and that's what he did. And I think it's pretty interesting that in at least a couple of the interviews focusing on Vietnam, he insisted on doing several takes, and if he wasn't happy with how he had responded perhaps to a particular question on the war and how it was going in Southeast Asia, then he would want to do that take over again. And Vietnam is an interesting case because the war goes south. The problems accumulate in Southeast Asia as his administration progresses, so it becomes more of a challenge, and the need to at least spin things to a degree, to portray things as being less gloomy than they really are, takes on added importance. And so you get him acting accordingly. And he could be, by the way, I'll just say this, he could be somewhat contradictory on this. So he will say, for example, to Walter Cronkite, that Vietnam is their war. We can't win it I'm paraphrasing, but we can't win it for the South Vietnamese. They're the ones who are going to have to win this war. We can't do it for them. So he'll say that on the one hand. But on the other hand, he'll also say it would be a mistake for us to withdraw. That would be terrible. And so he'll talk, as politicians do, out of both sides of his mouth occasionally, no question.
Yep, modern day spinning of the situation.
Yeah, no question.
So thinking about this, going past President Kennedy, what did Kennedy's decision to have live televised press conferences mean for following presidents, particularly maybe presidents who wouldn't have wanted to been so open with the media? Were they kind of now set to have to also do these press conferences? Like once you open Pandora's box, you can't close it again?
I think that's right. I think Pandora's box was open, which is not to say that subsequent presidents were either as good at this as Kennedy was, or they had them with the kind of regularity that he had. I think he averaged over his presidency one live press conference every 16 days, 1-6. That's a lot. But I do think there was no going back in the sense that presidents after Kennedy had to, with some regularity, face the press in an unscripted setting, which is to say you wouldn't know what they were going to be asking, and you had to do it live. At least much of the time, you had to do this in a sort of unvarnished, unscripted way that people could see, interested viewers could see in their living rooms what the president is saying about this particular issue. And that's in part from Kennedy. And if you look at crisis moments, notably the speech that he gave on October 22nd, 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, very important address to the American people and to the world. That kind of thing became, if not the norm, it became something that presidents on occasion had to do. It had happened to some degree before Kennedy, for sure, but I think, because of his use of this, it became more common.
And speaking of crisis, I think I can't not end this interview without bringing up the current crisis we're in with COVID-19, where we're seeing a lot of different elected officials giving press conferences on a daily basis, governors, the president, obviously. What, just from understanding President Kennedy, who sort of pioneered the live televised press conference, and you see the various executive officers now across the country, some becoming almost very famous for their frank press conferences, like Governor Cuomo in New York, who's like sort of become a national figure for his live televised press conferences right now going on in New York. If you want to give us a reflection on what you see and sort of how do you see Kennedy's influence in some of these figures who are going out there?
Yeah, I think I'd say a couple things about how this compares to our current moment. One is that those politicians who we're seeing on a daily basis, who have command of detail and are on some level comfortable in front of the camera, it's both of those things, I think, are getting deserved praise from viewers. And it's a reassuring thing to see your leader out there in a time of acute crisis, it's speaking in this way, knowing what he's talking about or what she's talking about, being able to convey the message in a clear and forthright and concise way, showing a sense of empathy. There are a lot of things, I think, here that are being done effectively by some of the governors and others who are speaking. No question. And I think that's something that harkens back to Kennedy, but whether they're aware of it or not, I think that's part of it. The other thing that I think is interesting is that Kennedy understood that there could be too much of a good thing, and I don't think he faced anything quite like the crisis that we're in currently. So it's very possible that a President Kennedy today would also feel compelled to be out there in front of the cameras every single day. But I think he understood that even though he had frequent press conferences, you didn't want to overdo it. There was a possibility of doing too many of these. I think he was aware of that. And so he might think that if you compare him to President Trump, for example, that Trump would be better off not coming out every single day in these briefings, and that he would actually get more bang for the buck. He would get more people paying attention. He would get more support ultimately if he held back a bit more than he's doing.
Yeah, or at least maybe making them more concise. I think that's been one criticism.
Yeah. Well, that's one criticism. The other criticism, I think, is that he doesn't have command of policy. I don't think he's ever pretended. That's not been his thing. And I think he was elected anyway, though it was pretty evident in the last campaign that policy detail, knowing the history of particular issues, knowing the various options for tackling problems, it's just not something that Donald Trump has seen as being important to him, and his supporters would appear to agree that that's not what they're looking for in a president. But that's an important difference between these two presidents, that Kennedy knew his stuff and was interested in stuff in a way that our present incumbent is not.
So in a way, would you agree, and you can reflect on this, but the live press conference can, one, if you're prepared and you go out there and you know your stuff, can enhance your trustworthiness with the community, can make you appear like someone who has a grasp of the issues. But if you go out and do these and you're unprepared, it can have the opposite effect.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think there are reasonable people can agree or disagree about Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, and how he's handling the crisis overall. Is it the case that both the state government in New York State and the municipal government in New York City could have acted more quickly, should have done things differently? Yes, that's certainly an argument one could make. But in terms of how Mr. Cuomo handles himself in this setting, I think one has to acknowledge that he that he does convey authority in a way that is reassuring to people, and he indicates that he knows what he's talking about, and I think that probably also served him well in political terms, in crass political terms, but more importantly in terms of showing New Yorkers, indicating to New Yorkers what the government is doing, what's happening, what are the experts and others doing to try to make this situation better.
So I think what we've learned here is that through President Kennedy's example, these live televised press conferences can be incredibly helpful as long as you are also prepared because they can be incredibly difficult in times of crisis to do. They're not as easy as they look. It's not a matter of President Kennedy just going out there and talking with reporters. He goes out there prepared.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'll say, if I may, Matt, one other thing that I think is worth noting here is that President Kennedy believed very strongly in the vital importance of having a free press. And so even though he could be ticked off, as many presidents can be, about what this or that reporter said on this or that issue, he could be thin-skinned, I think it's fair to say, JFK. But I think it's important that he never doubted, and he said in several interviews, notably one in 1962, that for a functioning democracy, it was absolutely imperative that you have in society, in a free society, you have an active press, that you have reporters who challenge leaders respectfully, but who challenge them on key issues, and then report in a straightforward way what they find. And that was something that I don't think he ever doubted. It may go back in part to his own experience as a reporter. Again, he had I think a deep sense of the profession. But in our own time, I think it's worth reflecting on that. As far as I can see, and I'm still researching volume 2 of my biography, but from what I can see, an unshakable faith in what the role of the press is, how important that is, how it needs to be a free press. And he distinguished here between the Soviet system, where you didn't have a free press, and the American system. And I think he spoke powerfully to that distinction. I think it's part of what some people, or what scholars would later refer to, soft power. My colleague here at Harvard, Joe Nye, suggesting that it's not just about military power or economic power, it's about those more intangible elements that you need as a superpower, and a free press and a commitment to it was one of them, and I think Kennedy got that.
Well, Fred, thank you. I think that's a great way to end on it today. I appreciate you talking with us. And
sure.
And as far as anyone interested, again, your biography, the first volume of the biography on President Kennedy, comes out in September. Thank you so much for being here.
It was a pleasure. Thanks, Matt.
Take care. Thank you for listening to this episode of JFK 35, a podcast from the JFK Library Foundation. We hope you enjoyed this episode on President Kennedy and his press conferences. Stay with us next time as we bring you more stories from the JFK Library. If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tweet us at JFK Library using the hashtag JFK35. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And if you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening, and have a great week.